For those of us in the room and staying in this room online, the theme is architecture. You thought we had missed them out, but of course not. Norfolk has an abundance of amazing low-carbon architecture. We are in one building today. On Monday, some of us went on a tour to the Sterling Award-winning Goldsmith Street, a low-carbon social housing development, and BT Passive, which makes prefabricated low-carbon construction materials. We're sat now, as you know, in the Enterprise Centre designed by Archetype. But as well as indigenous ways to design buildings to reduce energy use, buildings can also produce energy. They can be designed inclusively for their human and non-human residents. So let's welcome to the stage for our next conversation, Deborah Nagan, to introduce two very special guests in conversation. Deborah is a passionate and expert advocate for quality, sustainable design and placemaking, with over 29 years of landscape architecture and design experience from concept through to implementation. So Deborah, over to you.
Thank you very much. So I feel we have a really good opportunity to follow straight on from the discussion on food. So much of what's just been said about soil and saying it in this building is relevant to where we want to go. So first I'd like to introduce to you Sarah Wigglesworth, who is an architect you should all know about. And if you don't, you must look up her work, and we will do a little bit of a focus on Stock Orchard Street, her own house today, because it's got lots of exemplars that we can use for this conversation. And I'd also like to welcome Dr. Ehab Sayed, I hope I've pronounced that correctly, who runs an organisation called BIOHM. And his involvement in built environment is at almost at the other end of the scale, at the material scale. He then jumps right over everything architects do and goes right into social good and uses what he does in materiality to create a really different culture around how materials are procured and used in buildings. So welcome to you both, and thank you for coming to the discussion. And I thought I would start by slightly embarrassing Sarah by reading a little tiny bit from a magazine article about your house when it came out. So, this is what Peter Davey said. Number 9 Stock Orchard Street is the most sexy and witty building I've seen for years. Fetishistic, full of very clever invention, happy with overlapping storytelling, wild yet tender, ever open to change, tower and garden, green yet industrial. We all live in houses like that in our imaginations. And it is a wonderful house, and has been attributed with some really game-changing ideas and innovations. And so perhaps you'd like to lead us off on where that's taken you since you built Stock Orchard Street, how your architecture has moved from that point.
Okay, well, I'll do my best. So, I mean, if anybody doesn't know about that, it incorporates straw bales, recycled newspaper, crushed concrete in gabions and so forth. So it's looking at simple ways of building, but using the circular economy. And actually, we did a lot of research to kind of tease out the sort of menu of materials that we might use in this, which didn't conform to the standard sort of understood archetypes of high and low tech. So it was both tech in very many ways. The most simple construction techniques that might date back a really long way, but also the best windows that we could possibly afford that are coming out of something, an industrialized process. So that kind of confusion of kind of current understood typologies was actually based on the idea of reducing energy use within the building and also the carbon content of each of the products. Their pollution capability, how they were made, whether they can be recycled, and so on and so on and so on. And those kinds of criteria have become much, much more common and part of the discourse of what architects get involved with nowadays. But when it first burst onto the scene, Peter Davey was probably about the only person in Britain to kind of get it, as it were, or at least get the sort of aesthetic that lay behind it, because it's also a very haptic and sensual building, partly because it contains all these textures, colours, and kind of surfaces which were quite hybrid and very, very sensory, very, very sort of textural, very tactile. And those are themes which have continued through our work, but increasingly, since we've done more, let's say, larger projects and projects for clients who are much more interested in perhaps retaining their real estate value, or their investment value, or that need to conform to very strict regulation or whatever. We haven't been able to use those kinds of materials nearly as much as we would like to, and it's been interesting to sort of push back against the sort of conformity that architecture tends to follow, and how difficult it's been to carry through a lot of the ideas that we used in that original building. And obviously it was for ourselves, so we could, play, as it were, but we've really had to rein it in, I think.
What you can't see, Sarah, is that behind you there are a number of images. Your house pops up occasionally.
Okay.
There are materials that are coming out of Ehab's business as well. And there are images to hopefully inspire you about how building and nature can go together and should go together. From Sarah's palette of materials, we're leaping into the future now, using things like mycelium and other interesting grow-it-themselves type materials with a new approach to supply chain. So what Sarah really mentioned there was the difficulty of using unusual materials when you're building big and mass-producing and scaling up, and that's something you're tackling. So do tell us a little bit about BIOHM.
Yeah, so we take inspiration from nature to develop radical technologies, products and materials for construction in various industries. But one of our kind of flagship products is insulation made out of mycelium, the root structure of fungi. And we grow the mycelium on waste streams from agricultural sector or food sector. And we're able to then create materials that are outperforming established plastics and synthetic materials, but are completely natural with no additives or coatings or so on. And there's a real barrier in the industry from a regulation perspective to getting these materials in, because when you develop something made out of mushrooms that no one's ever imagined within standards and regulations, you've got to use the existing standards that have been developed by plastic manufacturers for plastic insulation products. And conforming to those standards gives you a disadvantage and also creates an almost impenetrable barrier to entry. So we've gone around that by working closely with major multinationals within the sector that we're introducing our products. And they've already got established supply chains, established distribution channels, and established relationships with the accrediting bodies. And they're able to license the technology. We use a much more, compassionate or involved approach to licensing, where we put in very stringent clauses in our license agreement with major multinationals, where they have to, for example, put a profit share within 100 kilometers of every factory they set up to the local community, and only use 60 miles radius resources throughout their entire supply chain. And that enables them to create little nodes of regeneration that are not just environmentally regenerative because we're reusing waste and we are sequestering carbon, but it's also socially regenerative because of that boost or injection of finance within the local economy. Where the value is being created, you're putting the value back into the local community where it's being produced.
And there we have this perfect example of a regenerative system, something where you're getting out more than you're putting in, doubled with the fact that this stuff is growing itself anyway, with very little input. And I was struck when I first spoke to you about this the other day, how very similar it is to the economic model proposed by Mariana Mazzucato about how you make really significant large changes, and to help us in the built environment industry, where whilst it's important to build lovely houses for individuals to live in, to build those small, delicious buildings, some of the little things you see here, it's really, really important that we're able to scale up, not just to give more people the benefit, but to find a way of really tackling problems with big numbers, the housing crisis, maybe the refugee crisis, all kinds of things where people in numbers need great buildings and immediate buildings to sort out the situation they find themselves in. So, Sari, when we spoke, you mentioned the need to move to regenerative architecture, and I wondered if you would like to tell us what your feelings are about that, how you would define that, from an industry standpoint where we perhaps use up and waste so much.
Well, I mean, I suppose the definition is that, we're using 3 times what we have on the planet at the moment, and we can't continue to do that. So we've got to find new ways in which we can use the resources that we have. And that's non-exploitative, and it's also reusing what we've got, and it's a circular economy, and it's growing buildings. So, I think it's sort of not one or the other, it's everything, and you're growing buildings in a sense, because you're growing the mycelium, which is going to make the insulation. There are lots of experiments going on with seaweed, with straw, with wood, tons of experiments going on with crop-based and hemp, things like that, to begin to develop products which can be both blocks or bats or, whatever it is. And it really needs to speed up and get kind of purchase and acceptance within the mainstream if it's going to have the impact that we really need in order to meet our climate targets. So I think the thing that is frustrating as the architect is the lack of kind of will or incentives. Perhaps they're legal incentives, perhaps they're building regulations, those kinds of things. Or, government leading the way through its commissioning of its own buildings, this kind of thing, that will incentivize the industry to really get with it and help people like you, scale up the product and roll it out into the market and get the kind of certification that is needed. But I'm in a way, I'm really interested also in the sense of what it means for craft, because I think, if you take something like the straw bale product, that was literally a straw bale that you got off a farm near Cirencester, and we found a way of sort of stacking it and building walls. Yeah, they were very, very cheap. They were about £1 a bale, so that's a lot of wall for a very little money, and it's extremely good insulation. So, there's a sort of real win-win-win behind it, but it has not had mainstream acceptance, and partly because it's seen as novel, therefore risky, no one knows how to do it, the acceptability is much less, etc. Will it get the fire certification? Will it get can it be insured? All of these sort of, can you even get a mortgage for it? All of these things are barriers in the way of the acceptance. And then, of course, the builders don't know how to use it either, although it's very simple to learn. But the way that people are trying to get acceptance for bales now is by making it into a kind of off-the-peg product, which you can then put, made in a factory, bung together with around timber, and and so it becomes a sort of modular system. And that is, in a way, I think, a transitional or an alternative way in which market might find that kind of product more acceptable, as long as all the other things can also fall into place. So I think there are some experiments that are quite niche, but they're happening, but probably not fast enough.
And also, one of the ways that these things can be better products for buildings is also with a mindset change. And this is something we chatted about the other day. Yeah. This sad fact that we seem to think that buildings are finished and we don't need to look after them anymore. We might have to send the Hoover round, but we don't actually get in and look after them. And I was really struck yesterday when I stood in front of this building and somebody said to me, thatch, how long's that going to last? It was the very first thought that came. And I mean, I don't really know the answer to that with this building, but I do know it won't last unless it's looked after. But so much of what we build won't last unless it's looked after anyway. So with your products, perhaps tell us a little bit about how you do use them and look after them, and how do you, once you've grown them, how do you stop them growing?
Yes. So the process is quite simple. You are introducing a fungi to a waste stream that is something that it's already built an appetite for in nature. And once it's completely colonized it, you cure it by either dehydrating it or using some kind of heat. And once that's done, it's just a benign foam material, just like a plastic foam, but completely natural, made out of fungi. And when we are looking at developing the product and the form of the product and how the builders are going to interact with them, how the architects will use them, we found that there's kind of 3 different stages at which we can introduce our technology. And one of them could be through just like-for-like replacement for existing rigid plastic insulation panels. And that way there's no training required. You've kind of broken down a lot of the barriers that you would have normally with a new or novel technology. And the second stage is to bring in something a little bit more radical, something that is perhaps grown into the building and then cured on site. And the third stage is to completely transform everything where the entire building is grown itself from different organisms. And this kind of approach enables us to be a bit more compassionate and empathetic to the industry's current worldview, and appreciating that it does take time to change perceptions. We currently have a sense of urgency because of the climate crisis. I don't necessarily think it's a climate crisis, because after the climate it'll be some other crisis. It's a thinking crisis that we've got. It's the way our logic works, the way that we've created our value systems and our value chains that is manifesting in a climate crisis that we're seeing. So I think it's important to focus more on changing perceptions over time rather than trying to transform something overnight, which is very difficult when we know how stubborn people's mindsets are and worldviews are, and it's a kind of a shock to the system. So it's important to take people by the hands through that journey.
So that's an optimistic way of looking at what I've been calling climate breakdown, which is to say it's a dynamic situation. You've got some products that can fix some of the issues that are coming up, and we keep on developing those things and add further layers of insulation or fewer as the climate might change. But in a sense, the whole system then is consistently moving along. And Sarah, what you've been doing recently is going back and looking at your home and asking some really searching questions about the decisions you took when you made it those years ago, and whether they were decisions that lasted. So perhaps tell us a little bit about what the looking back and the retrofitting has brought.
Yeah, so when we built Stock Orchard Street, it was quite cutting edge as a green building, and it was actually designed to something like the 1995 building regulations or something. So, for example, reed beds weren't even in the building regs at that point, so we couldn't do them. But gradually, over the 20 years that we'd been in occupation, obviously the regs have got more tighter, and we've all become more conscious about energy use and the climate. And our building was sort of touching then on more or less just above average. And we thought, well, that's not good enough. So we want to kick it back into being cutting edge again. So we decided to do a retrofit. And interestingly, we discovered that, of course, the way we designed it originally wasn't really fit for a very good retrofit. For example, it has continuous steel columns that go all the way through the building, and so we have cold bridging absolutely everywhere. And so it's a bit like if you wanted to design a passive house building, you would not start with ours, definitely not. So if we had our time again, we might think about it differently. Were we chasing that as a target? But we decided to do a retrofit anyway because partly the building's a research project and it's a way in which we can learn through doing it ourselves. So we decided to do some testing on it. We did airtightness tests, we did U-value testing, we looked at the energy bills that we had for 20 years, we did thermal imaging, and then we built a passive house model. And out of all of that, we identified a lot of faulty areas, a lot of uncontrolled ventilation escaping through the walls, because we built a lot of space, but very, very cheaply. So we weren't paying attention to any of that at the time. And anyway, long story short, we ended up insulating areas, thickening out walls, air tightness taping everything. We pulled it all apart and put it back together again. It took 9 months, but we've cut our carbon by 62%. So I feel very chuffed by that. And it's been a real lesson in retrofit. And I think, what it teaches me is that, we did a lot right, actually. Our R&D really paid off. The bales were one area which worked very, very well. So I haven't got any complaints there. But, you live and learn. And I think retrofit has got to be the future.
It's a really good note to come to about retrofitting buildings. But I wanted to ask you about a sort of moral issue, to balance that against the stuff that we build and what the built environment industry does. To take us back to this issue that we're supposed to be asking ourselves about nature and conservation, because what building does is use up land, often very wastefully and greedily, and often really for a very singular purpose, to make profit from the building, not with any real regard for what else you could do, let alone what was there before. And so my question really is about how you should regard nature when you're making buildings. And using it for the products that the buildings are made out of is certainly one way of doing it. But there's this wider story about the relationship between buildings and nature in the first place that I thought you might like to touch on.
I think we should go back to how Janine Benyus describes our relationship with nature, or how we should view nature when it comes to design. And it's viewing nature as the measure, the mentor, and the model. It's the model that inspires you, that you kind of build your designs based on. It's the measure that you measure your designs against to make sure that they stack up to natural laws and the natural systems and behaviors. And it's the mentor that kind of guides you when you're just trying to find inspiration, when you're looking to solve really wicked problems. It is your mentor. And I think we mustn't forget about what happens after the design is complete and the building is in place. Throughout its life, it must be embedded in nature. So not only is it grounded and foundationally driven by nature in its design, form, materials, and production, but it's also embedded in nature throughout its life, and it's actually serving a purpose that is bigger than just a shelter, because we rarely find in nature where shelters are just shelters. They often serve multiple purposes. And if we're looking at buildings, whatever it is, as carbon banks, material banks, or if we're looking at them as something that can help sequester carbon throughout their life or serve a bigger purpose, I think that's kind of where we need to be looking at the future, moving closer to creating living buildings that are agile, that are responsive to the changes within the communities that they host.
That's a very poetic way of putting it. It's a really lovely way of thinking about nature. And I think that point you made towards the end, which is much missed, is all of those other benefits that accrue because you decide to, at the first level, perhaps work with plants, but then to bring nature in, and the health and well-being effects you get of making nature a partner in your building process. Sarah, have you any thoughts you wanted to add? I suppose,
perhaps my answer is much more banal than your poetic answer, so sorry about that. But I suppose one of the things that goes through my mind is that, there is clear pressure on, the natural environment through population growth and expansion of cities and suburbanization and transport and all these other things that make up the industrial society. And we do need to rethink that. And I think density and, making cities denser and getting away from suburbanization is one way of doing that. And I think we do need to do that. And I think the 15-minute city is a good model for that. But at the same time, we need to think about what our transport links are and how we surface our roads and our pavements and get nature embedded in the city so that we don't think about these things as either or, but both and. So that everything's really integrated, including the productive landscapes that might go with where people live or work, and even hybridization of buildings so that, we don't just think of houses as places we live or places of leisure, but they're now places of work, or they might be small factories or whatever it is, So there's a kind of fluidity about the use of different buildings so that they can be repurposed and relevant to and adaptable to the future.
So not a site-based model at all, but really understanding that nature is a much wider beast, much larger ecosystems, the effects of your building work in one place extending far, far from that site, and stitching it all back again to keep our natural system working and viable for us to be able to build in it, to live in it. Yeah. Thank you so much, both of you. Any further thoughts on conserving nature in architecture? I'm going to end, I think, with an idea about...
We have a couple of questions online, if that's all right.
Yes. I didn't think
there was a lot of questions online, so I'm just going to ask a couple, if you don't mind. So first, from Ran, we are going to need a lot of insulation materials, but in the UK there are very few producers of natural insulation, e.g. hemp, and none at Class 2 making wood fibre insulation. How can we encourage UK manufacturers to get established and use natural products?
Perfect question for you.
I think for a product to be taken up by contractors, first and foremost, it needs to meet all of the standards and regulations. It needs to have the appropriate accreditations. But it needs to also be a very easy transition. If it's something that is completely different, that requires a very different way of working, a very different way of installation, unfortunately, it makes it much more challenging for it to be taken up. And that's why we went down the route of making our panel almost indistinguishable from a plastic panel, although it does look a bit moldy. But in terms of form and the way you install it and so on. So I think, if it's easy to install, no training required, affordable, meets all of the performance requirements, then it's a no-brainer. But I think now we're seeing contractors value the environmental benefits of natural insulation materials more. And so that becomes another factor, of course.
Great. And then there's some conversation about a link to AI earlier, because I think BIOHM have mentioned they use AI to evolve their I can't pronounce that word, strains. And just to elaborate on that, and maybe just one final from online, is that the main characteristics of bio-based materials is that they can be decomposed and returned to the biological cycle. Is this against the durability and long-lasting idea from customers about architecture? How do we overcome that barrier?
Well, durability we did touch on before, and I think durability we would all agree is a factor of how well you look after your building, a matter of knowing exactly what to do once you've installed your product, I think.
I would also say that I think using natural materials does require us to understand building physics, moisture and things like that much better than we do. And it wouldn't be a bad thing if we all understood that better and really, got with it in the way that we understand how buildings work. And if we could do that, then I think we can master the whole thing. It's not beyond our wit at all. And perhaps we've become quite kind of blasé about accepting that, you know, these materials will just perform and expect them to do that. And that goes back to the maintenance idea as well.
And that idea of being blasé about these things, we talked about those additional benefits of nature, like health and well-being. Yeah. Buildings that are not properly ventilated or where you don't know about things like that are unhealthy buildings to live in, yet our reliance on being able to go to the doctor when we've got ill, as opposed to live a healthy life, is driving that system whereby we're not able to look after the things we've got, including our own bodies.
Yeah, just on the AI point, we use AI to basically look at all of the genomes that exist in the world, and then we sequence them and then identify what sequences are likely to degrade a particular waste stream, and then we evolve our technology using directed evolution, which is a natural process. We basically mimic evolution that happens in the forest in a lab environment, and then test those assumptions that AI has made.
That is a wow for an end. A real wow for an end. That's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.